Disclaimer, this is the second part of my full review of Red Dead Redemption 2 and will primarily be focused on the story aspects, which I intentionally left out of the first part of my review to give it some more justice. You can proceed with this part if you have not watched the first, but be warned that it's basically just going to be all focused on spoiler related topics and thoughts. So as was stated in the disclaimer, this is part 2 of my overall Red Dead Redemption 2 Twitter Classics review, so if you're picking up from here you should be fine, but I think of course I would go ahead and recommend that you watch the part 1 as well, as that focuses on main aspects of gameplay and this will mainly focus on the story aspects. With that said and done, I do want to say that the conclusion to the part 1 of my review is my assessment for the gameplay and experience of the game. It did not reflect story aspects including the gameplay of the story, which this part will combine in an overall score at the end. With that stuff out the way, I do just want to get straight into the story aspects, so we won't linger here in the intro any longer. So the basics of the main story, picking up from where we were in part 1. Essentially this section is going to be a brief summary of each chapter in the game, my thoughts on them, before we get into more specific points that we can look at. So chapter 1, Coulter, the gang after the Blackwater massacre, is getting back on their feet, recovering, moving. A few key figures are established here, of course referring to the characters within the gang and their importance, such as Dutch, Micah, Arthur, John, etc. But beyond that, we see the introduction of the O'Driscolls here. We see Sadie Adler and Kieran joining the gang. We hear mention of Leviticus Cornwall as we rob a train and steal a few of his bonds aboard. This chapter is definitely one of the slower ones, but I think that's necessary. It throws a lot at you, hoping you will pick up on characters, situations, etc. as they happen, because you are essentially dropped into the world. They're not going to particularly break everything down for you easily in terms of what happened, who's who, etc. because you are the observer here. We are watching the world take place a lot in this chapter. Because of this, the chapter is quite slow paced and tutorial like in nature. It can make a lot of people bounce off the game early if they don't really feel or click with the game, which is a shame, but that goes with the territory. It did only take an hour or two at the end of the day, so it's not the best chapter, but it's definitely not the worst. It's a necessary foundation for the whole story to kind of stand upon. The chapter ends with the train heist you essentially are preparing for throughout the whole chapter. You get a good sense and peek at the honor system. You're presented with some choices that in the grand scheme of things don't really mean anything, but it serves as a good introduction. Chapter 2, you're now out into the world proper. You can free roam from this chapter on, which at the beginning really adds to the vastness of the world. For it all to culminate into a sort of step out moment in chapter 1 regardless, I think this is one of my favorite chapters because it's that kind of time where you're starting to understand a lot of the characters in the gang. Apart from being on the run, nothing really bad has happened yet. You're essentially in recovery mode, but the gang is still relatively secure despite the dire situation. The main town in this chapter is Valentine, which I really have to stress the great feeling that Valentine displays to the player. As I said in part 1, it really has that main town energy. It presented with a few branches and different problems to go and solve in this chapter. A lot of it is still a tutorial in a lot of ways, but it's slyly presented, so it's just integrated more into the missions than rather a direct tutorial. And they are tutorials to more subtle systems, like for Who Is Not Without Sin, you get a tutorial for poker, and there's a tutorial for witnesses if you commit a crime in the same mission and how to deal with them, etc. But yeah, a lot of this chapter is getting to know most, if not all, of the main gang a lot better, to the point you at least know who everyone is by the end of chapter 2. You are also trying to tie up some loose ends here and getting an introduction to Sean, which you save as he was captured in the Blackwater massacre. You're dealing with the O'Driscolls a lot here, either out in general gameplay or in the story. Don't think, by the way, just because chapter 2 has still a lot of tutorials, that important story events don't still happen in it. We have the whole debt collecting mission here. For those of you who know, this is a very pivotal story moment that we'll get into chapter 4 and beyond. There's also Fisher of Men, which is an incredibly important story moment with the Pinkertons. They offer Arthur a way out. We get more context into Arthur as a character, finding out he was wanted for $5,000, which back in 1899 is a lot of money. Milton and Ross, two Pinkerton agents, essentially at the end of the day taunt Arthur, saying that they've tortured Mac, a member of the gang who we don't get to meet. We can still see that it hits Arthur. The chapter ends with the gang having to move from Horseshoe Overlook due to a shootout in Valentine due to Leviticus Cornwall and his men. Is still angry that we've essentially robbed him many times at this point. Dutch decides to move the gang and Micah suggests a place around Dewberry Peak. Charles and Arthur go to scout out the area. Chapter 2 ends with Clement's Point being established. I know I'm kind of going through these fast, but there's a lot to get through before we actually start looking into stuff in detail. Chapter 3 revolves around roads, and particularly getting to know and acquaint yourselves with the two families who run the town, the Greys and the Braithwaites. This chapter is really where Sadie becomes a character. She's present throughout chapter 1, 2 and beginning of 3 where we got her in the gang, but she wasn't really too much of a character until now. We also get to see some tutorials scattered throughout this chapter as well, less impactful ones, but they are still here in some aspects. Some of the missions here also require stealth as their core theme, and as someone who doesn't really like or dislike stealth, I thought it was okay. Personally, I prefer stealth where you can kill stealthily. I think there was one stealth mission in this chapter which required you to not kill anyone, and it was like a hard fail, which I don't really like that. Which made sense from a story standpoint, but from gameplay wise, did weaken the fun of it. The whole chapter essentially is you increasing a rapport with the Greys and the Braithwaites, ultimately in a plan to rob both of them to get the noise Dutch wants to be able to get out of America and the country. And this is also a plan that comes from Micah. So after you've gotten to know the families a bit, you've caused enough tension and misrule amongst them that they think was caused by the other family, so they don't suspect you going in and robbing them blind. Ultimately, this plan is a huge failure as Sean is killed, as both families know that you're the one causing the trouble. He's killed in Rhodes by the Greys, but not only that, Jack, John Marston's son, is taken by the Braithwaites and given to Angelo Bronte in Saint-Denis. After burning down the Braithwaites' manor and setting out to find Jack, Pinkerton show up, offering the gang a proposal of amnesty to hand over Dutch. Every gang member refuses to do so, which is very, very interesting considering what happens later, but regardless, we'll get to that. They leave and the gang now needs to move again, because this time the Pinkertons showed up at the camp. I'll mention one other mission in chapter 3, and that was Blessed Are the Peacemakers. A very interesting mission because Colm O'Driscoll, the leader of the O'Driscolls, wants to parlay with Dutch. Micah thinks it might be a good idea, Hosea thinks it's a trap. Dutch goes with both Arthur and Micah as bodyguards. Arthur gets abducted by a few O'Driscolls, where Colm admits the whole thing was a ruse to capture Arthur so that Dutch will come after him, and then they hand Dutch over to the law. This is a very interesting look into Dutch and Arthur's camaraderie, or at least how others perceive it, because that Colm O'Driscoll would think that Dutch would instantly go ahead and save Arthur, leading to him being trapped and handed over to the Pinkertons. It's just an interesting observation, but regardless, Arthur manages to escape. The reason I mention this mission is because from this mission onwards, from what I can see, this is where cuffs start. Anyways, on to chapter 4. We're on the lookout for Jack, and this is the point where the gang really starts to fall apart or collapse. I'll get into it later, but this is where a lot of the stuff not only goes wrong from a standpoint of we have important character deaths here, Kieran, Lenny, Hosea, but also the mental decline of Dutch initially shows up here. In this chapter, I made it a point to start paying attention to Dutch more as a character, because for me at this point, I felt like I had a feel for all the characters. Charles was honorable, Lenny kind of like a nephew or son to Arthur, naive. Micah I just felt was a chaotic kind of force of nature type of character. There's a lot of wild stuff, but his missions are never boring. But when it came to Dutch, beginning of chapter 4, I really couldn't decipher him. On the surface, he kind of gave this honorable leader people would want to rally behind. What I mean by that is he cares about the people who are around him and a bit beyond, but towards his enemies there is no mercy. So a type of honor as much as this kind of outlaw can have. Something didn't exactly click with this assessment, and I think it was the end of chapter 3 that kind of solidified that. When Sean died, and especially with the Braithwaites, that was kind of a sign to me that he isn't how I really perceived him. And luckily for me, Bronte was there to kind of push my doubts into suspicions. While this chapter does have a focus on a lot of different plot points and a lot of pieces are starting to fall into place, I still think it's predominantly a Dutch chapter. We get Jack back kind of quicker than expected. Bronte basically hands him over after we do an errand for him in Saint-Denis Cemetery. By the way, I should have mentioned this, but this chapter takes place in Saint-Denis, and those of you who watch part 1 will know this is my favorite city in the game. But this does add some fondness to this chapter for me. A side plot that is expounded upon later is the Native American Wapiti Reservation side plot with eagle flies and rainfall. It doesn't seem that important right now in the story, but it is something that is major for chapter 6. And now in chapter 4 as well, we also get to see Dutch really snap in person for the first time when he kills Angelo Bronte for betraying him, stunning everyone that's there, even Arthur, in the savagery that Dutch displays as he drowns Angelo Bronte and throws his body to the bull gator swimming around in the waters of the swamp. From this point on, I feel that Dutch can't be viewed in the same way as his decisions without Hosea in chapter 5 and 6 are irrational, dangerous, and many times irredeemable for his character. Not morally, because he is an outlaw, much more of a sinner than a saint, but a lot of his actions kind of later show who he really is beyond being morally bad. They kind of put into question how he views the gang. Does he view them as his family, or are they merely tools to be expended? Does he actually care about anything beyond himself? Does he see the gang maybe perhaps as an extension of himself, an extension of his power and his influence? The answer may be more nuanced, and we'll try to explore this later. Chapter 5 begins after the bank heist fails. We see the gang in dire straits. Abigail and John are held captive, Charles left behind, Hosea, Lenny dead. We're stuck with Dutch, Micah, Bill, and Javier as we sneak onto a boat which gets shipwrecked and we end up in Guama, an island off the coast of Cuba. Now this is definitely the weakest out of all the chapters in the game. I think there was a lot of potential here. I believe a lot of stuff here was cut, but just by assessing what was in the game, it's a very short few missions I thought were actually pretty interesting. It's just that there wasn't enough of Guama to really incite the reaction I think you're supposed to get by the end of this part of chapter 5. I feels like this should have been a much longer chapter 3 sized chapter with a lot of developments, side stuff, to get to know the different characters here who only show up here a bit more. I would have liked to see more from Micah, Bill, and Javier in this chapter to kind of build up their characters some more in the style of how chapter 4 was Dutch's chapter. They could have seen some more, particularly both Bill and Javier. We do actually see more of Dutch's collapse, which I think is very important and substantially takes place in this chapter. But again, I do want to talk about this in another section, so I'll kind of lay off of that. I really liked how this chapter was a very action focused chapter. It feels like the missions in chapter 5 are all the end of chapter 3 Braithwaite Manor style of mission. They're very action focused and they're a payoff to a story, but the issue is that Guama didn't have any proper build up to justify the payoff. One pushback I can kind of see about Guama being the worst chapter is that having more time in Guama would have kind of ruined the pacing of the story, or at least damaged the pacing of the story. If we had spent a long time on Guama, don't forget we still had a lot of stuff happen at the end of chapter 4. Hosea, Lenny, dead. At this point we don't know the status of people who are left at the gang's hideout, so I can see from the standpoint that it would be good to maybe have a briefer time on Guama so we can actually get back to the main characters that we've got to know a lot in the gang to see what's going on. Chapter 5 doesn't also only have Guama, of course. There's also a brief part back on the main map where you do reunite with the main gang. It is significant. There is a nice section where you ride back to the camp at Shady Belle from Van Horn, and then we actually find the gang in Lakay, which is a partial reunion because of course John's still missing, and the reunion doesn't last for long as the Pinkertons show up just in time to have one last fun shootout of the chapter. Chapter 6 is a very, very interesting and more symbolic chapter than I think I initially realized, and of course we'll get into that later. The chapter really starts with us in Beaver Hollow, a new hideout around the town of Ansburg and Butcher's Creek, very early into this chapter, and I think even in chapter 5 you do finally find out that Arthur has TB or tuberculosis. I'm sure I don't need to explain why this is significant. He got it all the way back from chapter 2 where he did the debt collection mission and beat Thomas Downs to death, and he coughed some blood directly into Arthur's face. Regardless, it becomes clear that Arthur has a limited time alive, and this really adds a new dimension to the story and Arthur's character. Don't get me wrong, I always liked Arthur as a character, but once he finds out he has TB, he really starts showing the symptoms in earnest. And you know what it is and he knows what it is. It really changes his view on the world permanently, I would say, until the end of the game, at least on High Honor. But regardless, first priority of chapter 6 is to save John Marston from Siska Penitentiary. A lot of this chapter is wrapping up a lot of the storylines. There was a small side plot earlier in chapter 3 with the Braithwaite girl and the grey boy, and in chapter 6 you actually help them escape together. Also throughout chapter 6 we see a lot of the characters leave the gang, one such being Strauss. We have one more debt collection mission, and this time we have the option to even not only just not take any money, which we didn't have before, but even to give money. At this point, at least from the High Honor standpoint, I think we can see a lot of the larger shift in Arthur's character I was talking about earlier take place. We go back to Strauss and throw him out of the gang basically for being a leech, terrible person who preys on the weak but good-hearted people to then owe him to then get Arthur and others in the gang to beat, kill or shake money out of them. As I was saying before, chapter 6 is really about wrapping up storylines one way or another. Unlike the unlikely romance in chapter 3, there are some which do get a bit more violent. In this chapter, one of my favourite Dutch moments, and that's when Dutch kills Leviticus Cornwall. His facial expressions throughout this entire section, where he walks up to Cornwall, the voice acting, the performance capture, everything about the scene kind of goes full circle on Dutch's fall from leadership. There's also the hanging of Como Driscoll, which I think is another very good Dutch moment. The face that Como makes when he realizes that no one's actually coming to save him and Dutch is right in front of him about to watch him hang is truly haunting. We then also wipe out the O'Driscoll gang altogether, with Sadie later on in a mission for revenge for her husband in another good moment in the Hanging Dog Ranch. Now a very large section of this chapter is dedicated to Wapiti and the Native American side plot, which I really think merges with the main plot for a while it goes from something small to fighting the US Army, as Dutch really still thinks the situation is salvageable. You can see Dutch's manipulation out on full display, but from another perspective. This time we're not the ones being manipulated, it's Eagle Flies. I would like to say here that we kind of see how Dutch kind of acted before here in terms of how he interacts with Eagle Flies, but it has a much darker context. We see him push Eagle Flies in very discreet ways that would only benefit himself. The whole plan is still to make enough noise, this time between the Native Americans and the US Army, so then we can slip away. We see Dutch in this chapter at this point kind of seal his character in my eyes. Not only does he leave Arthur for dead and act like he didn't do it or really acknowledge it, which by the way, Eagle Flies helped save Arthur in that situation, which then led to Eagle Flies' death. And he does the exact same thing with John later on. This symbolizes something earlier that took place in chapter 6 if you paid attention to Dutch when we got to Beaver Hollow. But regardless, the whole affair ends in tragedy. After this takes place, we have a stretch until the ending, which I really want to dedicate a section on, so I'll move on to the epilogue for now. The epilogue takes place in 1907. You play as John Marston after the events of the ending of chapter 6 took place. Him, Abigail and Jack have kind of been in a constant cycle from what we can tell. They move, they start to get a good start. John then does something like kill someone, somebody maybe recognizes him, etc. And then they quickly have to move again. This time we're back in Shrewsbury and the events of the first part of the epilogue are pretty short and on a smaller scale. Basically John helps around a new ranch called Pronghorn Ranch, which wasn't there in 1899. There's a new gang introduced, and this time we're still isolated from a lot of the characters who used to be in the gang. The cycle I was talking about earlier essentially takes place in real time here. We get adjusted to working on Pronghorn Ranch. We not only get the suspicions of people at the ranch at first because we say we have no experience in the field, but when it comes to taking out some of the Laramites, which are the new gang I was talking about, it's crazy how weak we made them look. Anyways, we piss off the Laramites enough for them to get bold enough to try and burn down the farm. We go to where they are, which is Hanging Dog Ranch, and take them out. Abigail and Jack leave John because he just won't change. This is where John decides to buy his own farm and ranch, a place in New Austin around Blackwater called Beecher's Hope. We also get a letter from Sadie around this time basically telling us I'm a bounty hunter in the 8-year-long time skip. Regardless, part 1 of the epilogue ends with you purchasing Beecher's Hope with a loan from the banker in Blackwater, and you also reunite with Uncle from the gang after doing so. Now, epilogue part 2 is a lot more significant in terms of moments. We at this point are trying to keep our little ranch together, since one of the reasons nobody wanted it becomes very apparent. The Skinner brothers are a new gang only introduced and encountered in the epilogue, and they are really the most brutal, savage gang in terms of what they do to people. There's a few important story moments that we really see how bad they are, like how they were with Uncle, who basically burned his back. Another character that makes a return is Charles. We meet him in Saint-Denis, stays with us for a while. There's a few smaller moments too, like fishing with Jack, helping with some more bounties with Sadie. Of course, the great moment, John proposes to Abigail. A lot of similarity is with another situation. Finally, we get to American Venom, which is the last mission of the game. I also want to save this for later in the ending section, because it doesn't make sense to talk about American Venom without talking about the final mission of chapter 6. That's basically it for the summary of the story. As short as I could possibly make it. Let's actually get into talking about the story instead of just saying what happened. So on to talking about more of the pacing of the story in general. While the game took me 109 hours to beat, I honestly didn't feel the 2 months. I'm sure you guys know that there's different types of feelings when you go through a longer game. There's those where you start to sour on the game because it's just too long and you just want to kind of get it over with. As a result, the game not being made to be paced in the way it is, like when the devs turn a 20-hour game into an 80-hour game, does not feel good. Alternatively, however, if the game feels like it's made to be played for 80 to 100 hours, then it can very easily be an experience you get lost in. There's this kind of thing that I've been seeing going around in gaming lately, that long games are bad and we need more short linear experiences. In some points here I agree. Games that are not made to be large should not be bloated and forced to be something in the pursuit of trying to replicate something that isn't the thing that made it good in the first place, if that makes sense. I'll give an example. After Elden Ring, I feel like certain developers, not talking about indies, more focusing on AAA, got the wrong message about what made the game so popular. Let's be clear here. Elden Ring was what it was and did what it did because From Software nearly perfected the formula they've built on, iterated upon, experimented with over a decade, and Miyazaki knows what makes his games tick, and that mastery in combination with it being as accessible as ever made it sell over 25 million copies. It was not one individual thing that made Elden Ring popular like it was a Souls-like, and it neither had anything to do with the UI being cleaner. That's a nice little touch in detail, but cutting down the UI won't make people buy your game. Its success cannot be replicated as easily easily as just copying. I know I'm going off on a bit of a side point about Elden Ring, but the same thing can be said about The Witcher 3, the same thing can be said about Skyrim, GTA, etc. Now, what does this have to do with Red Dead Redemption 2's pacing? I would say that this is one of those games that's paced decently. There are some parts that are arguable here in terms of, chapter 5, and I think there are ways that they could have gone to make it better, and some people might say that the beginning section is paced rather slow to grab their attention, which I can see. I feel like chapter 2 is the true introduction to the world. It was long because it needed to be, because we are getting introduced into knowing the characters, the world, the mechanics, etc. Chapter 3 and 4 did feel as a result shorter in the actual stories, which is natural. Once you get to know the characters a bit, it's important to see how they evolve, or in some cases reveal their true selves, the different situations the game puts them in, and naturally that is just going to be shorter than an introduction to all of the characters that is in chapter 2. Chapter 6 did feel like the second longest chapter. I could be wrong on a runtime basis, but it felt quite long because it had to do the most out of all the chapters in wrapping up the story of the gang, wrapping up all the characters you've met, the storylines, villains, etc. All need to be dealt with here, so it could be that it's creating an effect that makes chapter 6 seem larger than it actually is, but it could just be that it is actually the second longest chapter. There's also a change that happens to Arthur at the beginning of chapter 6 in terms of him knowing that he has TB. The change that happens subsequently between Arthur at the ending of chapter 5 and Arthur at the ending of chapter 6, if you did high on it, is so large it can make it feel like a journey unto itself. Speaking of Arthur, I did want to talk about him more as a character, my thoughts on him as he grew, a man who's lived a life more troubled than most. He had a son who died, had a wife who died, father died, mother died, 15 years in the gang. That's probably been the thing that's kind of been driving him, made him kind of feel whole and content. But once the death of the American frontier, the death of the Wild West starts to take place, which is around the time of the start of the game, we can really see the isolation take place. What is it like to live in a world and a society that doesn't want you? And what can you do about it? Do you fight to your last breath for your way of life, devolve into savagery and barbarism? Do you run, try to escape the past, start anew somewhere else? But ultimately, does that matter? What do you really leave here on this earth? Who will you be remembered as? Are you a scrubbed footnote on the annals of history? Are you someone who people spit and scoff at the reminder of your name? Or are you someone who, even if you've done one good thing in your life for someone, they'd remember it forever? Now that's getting a bit too abstract, so I'll talk about Arthur specifically. Now, I thought from the beginning that he was a charismatic protagonist. He knows how to navigate and really get to know people, which is important for a protagonist because he is the lens that we view the story through. It may seem something obvious, but you'd be surprised at how much this actually affects your enjoyment of a story if you have a bad protagonist who isn't written well enough to be believable, charismatic, or even allow you to engage with the rest of the story. It can even really cut you off if it's done bad enough. When it comes to Arthur throughout the story, there isn't any time that he did something that fell off, except for the part where right after they robbed the bank in Valentine, where you basically shake down Mrs. Downs, the widow of the guy who gave Arthur TB after Arthur beat him to death for money. That really felt like something that would come back to bite Arthur very badly, because it's something where I don't know why it was something you did in the mission. Usually debt collection missions are a separate thing. From then, I kind of had this feeling that this was symbolizing something with Arthur's character in that moment. I couldn't really guess what, because it was so specifically done, it was kind of off-putting. Before diving into Arthur's change in chapter 6, I do want to talk about his kind of relationships with some other specific characters, Dutch, John, and very importantly also Mary Linton, who we didn't mention before, but essentially was with Arthur while he was with the gang in love for a while, but ultimately had conflicts because Arthur was an outlaw. I don't know how people feel about this character and her overall relationship with Arthur, so feel free to leave how you felt in the comments. I personally didn't really like or dislike the character too much at all. At most, I found her kind of annoying and hypocritical, but I do try and understand and appreciate that this is a very complex situation, like most things in Red Dead Redemption 2. And I do like the aspect that it's not really a black and white situation. It's closer to tragedy, to be honest. It's a relationship that can never truly work. Mary Linton is too emotionally attached to her way of life, rightly so in many cases, with the security, safety, and the honest way to live gives you. And while I did think that she wanted to be with Arthur, his ultimate drive is the life of crime at the point in the story where he and her really interact with each other. It's not only the only thing he's really done for the last 15 years, it's also the thing that has secured his future, his security, in a sense of the brotherhood in the gang. Him and Dutch at least had that kind of a way of, you could even, maybe if I misunderstand it, I saw it kind of like a more of a father-son type of connection. So he's asking her to leave her way of life, she's asking him to leave his way of life. Both completely ask stuff of each other that are completely out of their depths. She wants him to literally overturn everything in his life that he knows for her, while Arthur does want to be with her, but ultimately it amounts to more of a side thought in comparison to how he feels about the gang, in my opinion. That's how I saw it. Ultimately, it's a battle in Arthur's mind, a tug of war, one which he throws it all away or gives up on his values, his brothers, his family, for a life that he's never lived, or does he stay with security, his safety, his family, Dutch, and the rest of the gang, and see the journey to the end. This character gives me the feeling that there's a lot of differing opinions on them. I think it's definitely a source for people to kind of find where they stand. Are they more sympathetic towards Mary? Do they see her as well-meaning? A source for a new beginning that can never happen? Or I can see some people really hating this character, because like a lot of people in the real world, she's definitely hypocritical. She does manipulate to try and get what she wants. She's a multi-layered character and I find that interesting. I tend, as I said, to be in the middle, slightly leaning towards the more negative. I understand where she's coming from and I can sympathize a bit, but I still don't like her. For example, how she can criticize Arthur for being an outlaw and tries to stand on some authority while her father is a belligerent drunk idiot for the brief time that we see him in the second mission with her. From what is spoken about his attitude towards Arthur, she's clearly a bit inconsistent in her judgment, but that's the thing, people are very inconsistent. Someone's view of someone else can be opinionated, grandstanding, idealistically charged, until something like that happens to someone close to you and you can see how much of a bad situation it puts you in personally. The last thing on Mary, because we've been going on for a while here, there's different views, I think, on how people could view her hypocrisy. Maybe some could see it in a more critical view and they may say that this is blatant proof of her manipulation, that she doesn't really love Arthur and she has no love for him, because if she really did, she clearly shows a capacity to tolerate bad and irresponsible behavior from her family. If she can still stand them, why can't she stand and compromise with Arthur? Others, however, who are more sympathetic could actually see this as a point of tragedy for her. Her worldview is being stretched really thin by her father, and while she still loves him as a father, it's actually a burden to her, and all she wants is somebody to take her out of this and give her some stability in life. This makes her desperate attempts to kind of reach out and change Arthur make more sense later. For the second to last part of the section, I do want to talk about how chapter 6 and the TB changes Arthur's perspective, and it's a really interesting conversation that really did change how I thought of the story between Arthur and Charles. Take a listen.
Charles, if it goes bad in there, you get yourself out. You got more to lose.
No, come on, don't start talking like that.
I didn't tell you before, but I saw a doctor. It's pretty bad. Well, it's gonna get worse.
Oh, Arthur. Any day we can die. We're riding to break an Indian chief's son out of a cavalry fort. We could both die tonight. In a way, it is a gift to know. In a way, you were lucky.
Sure don't feel like that.
You still have time to make amends. The others, Hosea, Lenny, Sean, all them, they didn't. And what about the Calendar boys? Both killed trying to escape Blackwater? A more vicious pair of bastards than ever was. And that's all they ever were and will be.
Maybe.
You're lucky. You got the chance to do something better. My guess is maybe that's why you're here now. Either way, just keep your head strong.
Now, what I could get from that is the new perspective that Arthur is gaining from this experience. It could actually be more of a blessing as well as obviously being a curse. He knows he has limited time left. But here's the funny part, we all do. Nobody on this earth lives forever. We're all living with a certain amount of time, and in the end we all die. That will be it for us on this earth, in this life. So is it a curse or a blessing to be reminded of that and to not know exactly when your time is, but to know that it will be soon? Sean never saw his time coming, he just died. Lenny didn't see his time coming, he died as well. Kieran, Hosea, etc. They all died in tragedy and not having the opportunity to leave something here as a legacy. They did not have the opportunity to make good before they really got put in the ground. Arthur has that opportunity. He has the opportunity to do something that could really help someone. I think that's what chapter 6 is all about. That's the redemption after spreading chaos loss, death, destruction, etc. throughout the land. Your mortality stares you in the face and tells you you have a choice. Live as you do and die as a dog, or try to use this as a reminder of that ultimate fate. Try to help and set people up for good, and to save people from the other fate, to die and not even be remembered by a single person. Finally, I do want to talk about one final relationship or friendship or brotherhood, and of course that being between Arthur and John. I really found it profound and satisfying to watch from the beginning of chapter 1. We see definitely a skepticism from Arthur towards John. It's a relationship that does kind of grow naturally. I feel maybe Arthur has some resentment towards John after John left the gang before. At this point, we cannot neglect there's also the Jack and Abigail aspect too. Now, this is something I think that really encapsulates why he feels the way he does. If you know later on in the game, and I think in chapter 6 it's the first time that's mentioned that Arthur had a son and a wife before, and particularly that's really kind of a full circle moment to why he feels the way he does about John in the beginning. It's because John has what Arthur wishes he could have. And this is how I viewed it, right? When you see someone kind of throw away these gifts, maybe in the way you did, or maybe in the way that you took for granted, it kind of rubs you the wrong way, especially after they keep those gifts and they still continue to neglect them and not really understand what they have. That's just my view on it. I don't think I fully understand what's going on there, so I won't really comment further. It's kind of the vibe I got. You can definitely see that John and Arthur deepened this brotherly bond throughout the game, and it really takes off in chapter 6. With Arthur getting this new perspective on life. Knowing you are going to die really changes a person. Even though it's a reality everyone is faced with and will go through, being reminded of your mortality makes you think about what's going to happen after, because you will be powerless in those moments after you die. You'll want to put something in place now so you can set people up for success, and I feel like that's what really drives Arthur, at least of course in the high honor ending of chapter 6. Now, one final little note on Arthur as a character, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the best scenes in the game.
What's wrong?
I'm dying, sister.
Okay.
Yeah, I got TB. I got it. Beating a man to death for a few bucks. I've lived a bad life, sister.
We've all lived bad lives, Mr. Morgan. We all sin. But I know you.
You don't know me.
Forgive me, but that's the problem. You don't know you.
What do you mean?
I don't know, but whenever we happen to meet, you're always helping people and smiling.
I had a son. He passed away. I had a girl who loved me. I threw that away. My mama died when I was a kid. And my daddy, well, I watched him die. And it weren't soon enough.
My husband died a long time ago. Life is full of pain. But there is also love and beauty.
What am I gonna do now?
Be grateful that for the first time, you see your life clearly.
Sure.
Perhaps you could help somebody. Helping makes you really happy.
But I still don't believe in nothing.
Often, neither do I.
Huh?
But then I meet someone like you, and everything makes sense.
You're too smart for me, sister. I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
All aboard! I shall try.
I know you will.
As you can see, I didn't get this in my playthrough, but I did go ahead and react to it after, and it's a really special scene that we see a more vulnerable side to Arthur, and he goes through all the tragedies in his life and he recounts how he got where he is with this disease. He got it by beating a man to death for money he didn't have. Money ultimately doesn't matter because money won't save you from the eventual fate. And I do want to say that I thought it was good that he didn't do this with a member, because I feel like there isn't anyone at the camp he could really be this open about it with. Not Tilly, even though they have some rough side conversations that you can do. Not even John. It had to be in this kind of style to hit hard. And of course the face that Arthur makes when he utters the words, "I'm afraid." It says 1,000 words about him, and honestly I can't recount a game that had this level of facial expression holding so much meaning. For him to admit that he's afraid of death, and it kind of goes full circle on the idea that from the beginning of the game we typically see protagonists start at their weakest and then grow, if that makes sense. But we see Arthur, if you look at him mentally, right, from the beginning is very sound and secure, right? He doesn't portray himself as a vulnerable character in any way, but throughout the game the tuberculosis is a metaphor for the kind of decay from him in his strongest, being chapter 1 to chapter 6 where he is at his weakest, right? I think it's really interesting for him to have said that in chapter 6, that he's afraid of death. Or maybe it's not death that he's afraid of. The way I took it was death ultimately, but maybe there's other interpretations. Like what I was saying before, that kind of decay that takes place being that decay of him morally. It's of course also symbolizing the decay and death of the Wild West. As we've said many times in this review and part 1, that is a core theme of the game that you really can't escape. But anyway, spoken enough about Arthur, now on to the other gang members. Now this part of the video is going to be a tier list, so I'll skip over this. The me now will see you in the next section while the future me takes over. This is me in the far future. I don't know if you can see the day, but don't need to worry about that. And we are here with the tier list finally. I'm literally halfway through editing the video, so here is the tier list. Now you can see there's characters that aren't part of the gang. Yeah, because this list wasn't made by me, so just to save time I'm just going to focus on the characters in the gang, so I'm not going to go through all of these guys. It's just going to take too long, trust me, and some of them I don't remember, so let me just move it over here. Okay, I think that's everyone at the front. Trelawney being the last character. Everything's there. Sorry for this being kind of stapled together. It's not my list. This one, just to give credit, is made by... Go ahead and get started with the tier list. Okay, Strauss. Okay, this is starting off bad. Strauss, I think... in terms of being a member of the gang, let's be real, it's his fault that Arthur got TB, right? He was the one who gave him the mission to shake down Thomas Downs and said no matter what, get the money out of him because he's a liar. So automatically Arthur's going in there with like a let's go get this guy mindset. And also he gets kicked out for being a little leech. The only saving grace I think for his character is in the epilogue they do mention that he didn't say a word while I think he was getting tortured. He dies off screen. Let's put him at C. If he didn't get tortured to death and not say a word, he would be like a D or F. Let's put him at C. Okay, Sadie. She's definitely a good character, I think. The whole kind of how we find her, she definitely is a character who evolves throughout the story. One of the more like obvious developments that happens. What we see in epilogue to from how we saw her in chapter 1. It's basically two different characters. So very interesting character. Very, very good. I think what they did with her. Yeah, she's a good character. She becomes a bounty hunter. The whole revenge kind of story. The missions with her are good, in my opinion, at least. I don't think that gets her. I think that gets her A tier, maybe S. I don't know. I'm undecided. I'll put an A tier for now. If we're struggling for S tiers later, because there are some really, really good S tier characters coming up. So yeah, we'll still save that. We'll lock it in later on. Next we have Reverend. Is it Reverend? I don't even remember this guy's name. I think it's Reverend Swanson. Yeah, I'll be real. I don't really remember anything apart from there was that moment where he nearly. I think he was stuck on the train tracks or something like that. There's a nice moment that kind of replaces the "I'm afraid" moment that I saw, right? Because reasons I didn't do the side. I thought I could do the side mission later with the priest guy, then it kind of just messed up because I missed the mission and then I couldn't get the "I'm afraid" moment. So I guess that's there's a few times that we interact with him, but I don't really remember him too much, so he's gonna have to go. I don't see how I can put him above even Strauss. We interact with a lot, a decent amount. He's gonna have to go into like D. To be honest, I don't really remember anything about him distinctly too much, so he's gonna have to go into D tier. Sorry. Hosea, as I'm going to say in the future sections, I think Hosea is a very, very good character. I kind of like him as that old wise kind of character in the gang who's kind of seen it all. He's the only guy who can really tell Dutch, and Dutch actually listens at certain points in the story apart from Micah. But I think he serves that like as that kind of grandfather, uncle kind of figure, even to Dutch in the gang. I feel like at certain points he's definitely that angel on the shoulder of Dutch as well, as I'm going to see in the future. This is literally weeks after I recorded the other stuff, so I like the missions of Hosea. I like that fishing part of Dutch. I don't know if I can give him S. S really is like reserved for like the top of the top, so he might have to go in A as well, above Sadie. He's another one who might go into S tier, but we'll have to see. Javier, very cool character, I'd say, like in terms of the way he just kind of acts in his demeanor. There's a few moments I feel like in just like general gameplay in the camp where he was trying to hold things together, right? Because ultimately he's loyal to Dutch. He's a character who wants to keep the gang together, I feel, and you can really see in those later moments where he's like ultimately does take Dutch aside. And there's also some good moments with him and just like general, just from when I said earlier, I think how much of a good friend he is. I think in part 1 I said that. The only thing I would say against Javier is I would have liked to see more of him in certain parts. When I mean that, I don't mean he had like a lesser role. He had definitely had a big role in the story. So where would I put him? See, this is gonna be something where I'm just kind of biased, because I'd say Javier Drill, while I was playing, he was top 5 characters, so he might have to go and to be the first one in S, just purely off of nothing like empirically like he's better than Sadie and Hosea, just purely off of the way he comes off. He might have to go into S. We'll see. I think I'll put him in S for now, just to have someone there. Dutch, easy S. We're gonna have a whole section on Dutch later on, right? So I don't really want to talk about him too much, but he really deserves top of S, to be honest. Like, he's, in terms of kind of how open he is as a character, in terms of the interpretations you can have like the interpretation that he was always evil, you can have the interpretation that he kind of got corrupted, and have the interpretation that he meant well at the beginning but then later on kind of lost his way. You can have the interpretation that he went mad. You can really go wild with what you can think of Dutch, because there's so much layers to him, in terms of we hear about what he did in the Blackwater massacre, and that kind of serves as that distinct point where we hear he did something that then lines up later on with what he does. So there's a lot to say about Dutch. Okay, I can't really talk about it all in one part of the tier list. There's a whole section on him later, so we'll be back then. Abigail, she's a good character. I'd put her in B, a solid B character. So Abigail, I think she has some really good moments, especially in the epilogue. The moments with John were very nice, like strengthen her character, and there's also in the actual game as well, like the base game, she's alright. Miss Grimshaw, she's I'm thinking between B and C. She's definitely a good character. She's not a bad one. She has some really strong moments in terms of she being kind of like that, I would say, like maybe that mother figure in the gang. That there's that moment with Tilly that I thought was very, very good, where there was that guy who was trying to kidnap Tilly, or she did something like killed that other gang or whatever. There was that kind of side plot there, and then you can kind of see like that protective side of her, and she's very much someone who is strong in her beliefs in the gang. She's someone who I think in the end it's unfortunate the way it turns out for her, but I think maybe she can go and be. I don't think she belongs in C. Jack, I mean, I don't know how to feel about Jack. I think there's a few good moments with him. There's that dog appears, I think, in the gang. I think he doesn't really have too much. I think in Epilogue he's pretty good. I'm trying to think, would there be a reason for me to not put him? What would be the reason for me to not put him like on the same level as Abigail? I think a few of those good moments, so I think I might have to put him in B as well, but I don't think he's they fit in B. I don't know why I was thinking about maybe putting him in C. The moments that he is there, I think, are pretty good, and they kind of highlight, especially the fishing mission, that the 2 fishing missions, I think, at least with him, the one with Arthur, where the Pinkerton show up, and then there was the one with John where I think the dog dies. There's another dog, it's not the same dog, and there's the race, the horse race. I think that was with him, or maybe that was with the other kid, but I think that was with Jack. John Marston, put him S tier, obviously. I'm gonna get into this later on, but John is really, really good. He becomes the main character later on. Obviously in Red Dead Redemption 1 he was the main character, but just even when kind of said it in Arthur's part, just even his moments with seeing like how the brotherhood or like friendship between Arthur and John grows, and kind of seeing there's that moment, I think that's very, very very special and important when he gets back Jack, right, after we get him from Bronte, and then you can kind of see that really affects John, I think, in terms of how he thinks of himself as a father, how his son got taken from him, and his son liked the guy, if I remember correctly, because Red Dead Redemption 2 was kind of 2-3 months ago, so if I remember correctly, there was that moment where he's worried about Jack, and then Jack is fine, and then he was okay with Bronte, and that kind of affects him as a father. It's like, if my son feels like this, where someone who kidnapped him, which Bronte is not a good guy, right? Bronte is, at the end of the day, he's a very bad guy. If this bad guy can make my son feel this way, kind of realigns John's view of himself as a father, I think was very important for him to have that moment, and I really liked that kind of outcome that happened because of it. But there's also that kind of side plot where Dutch thinks that John betrayed him, and he might say it, he was going to leave John to hang. Just kind of that realization and that disillusionment, I think, with John happens, where he's like, you're gonna leave me to die. Dutch was really like, we'll get John back eventually. I have a plan to save him. But then I think there might be a moment, if I remember correctly, there might be a moment that he literally comes out and says, I was going to leave you to hang, to John's face. Very interested to see, I know, because I know Red Dead Redemption 1, John is the main character. I'm interested to see, like, when I play Red Dead Redemption 1, obviously review that and play that on stream, how kind of this evolves, because obviously the epilogue happens, and we'll get into that later on. But yeah, let's continue. Sorry, I have to look up her name, because I literally forgot. This is not a good indicator, by the way. Like, if I forgot her name, Karen. It's interesting that these two are next to each other. I think she dies off screen as well, like Strauss, but I think she dies from, I think you can kind of see after Sean dies, she kind of goes into the drinking problem even more than she was, and then I think she dies of alcohol poisoning. Somebody in my chat, I think it was one dude who told me that. Shout out to one dude. She was around for that one mission in Valentine when you robbed the bank. Don't really remember too much else that she was there for. Kind of like that tragic, you know, Sean dies, she kind of just disappears. I'm gonna have to put her in detail as well, above Swanson, but I don't remember anything else that she was there for other than that robbing the bank mission in Valentine. In terms of like major missions, I didn't see enough to really put her anywhere above D tier. Max is C tier. Sean, I think this is just another vibes moment. He was my favorite character before he died, and very big tragedy, so much potential. I think the way that they killed him was a very good way. I'll talk about like the collapse of the gang and deaths in the Dutch section as well, but the way that they dealt with, you know, that, like, he's a very likable character, at least to me, right? That cousin that, you know, he comes from somewhere else, but it's kind of that shared humor. Kieran, I think he's gonna have to go in. He's gonna have to go in A, bottom of A. Now, when it comes to Kieran, right, he kind of starts out as that nobody trusts him. He's literally tied up. Everyone in the gang is kind of obviously skeptical because he is an O'Driscoll fundamentally, right? I was enjoying how he was developing as a character. Him and Arthur was kind of having that more trust between them, and I would have liked to see that, you know, maybe in the later chapters, chapter 6, or even the epilogue. Maybe he kind of have that role as like, kind of like Sadie has later on as well, as that, like, I think Kieran would go with Arthur if he was around. I think he would be with Arthur in the whole kind of split that happens between Dutch and Arthur, John, Sadie, Charles with Arthur, and Dutch, Bill, Micah, and Javier with him. I think Kieran would definitely be on the side of Arthur regardless, right? It's one of those things where, talk about this later as well, but it's that potential lost, if you know what I mean. Not everyone gets to see their potential really fully fleshed out, if you know what I mean. Like, there's just people who just disappear off the face of the earth or just like die. Not everyone gets to see or have that full development, because I think Sadie does become like that fully developed, multifaceted character. Kieran doesn't get to have that development. Next we have Tilly. She has a similar thing with Mary Beth as well. There's like these moments in the camp where you can like sit down as Arthur. It's like two. I thought those were really good moments. Apart from the I'm afraid moment, I think those were the closest really to before that moment really happened. Like, apart from specified moments in the story, like the moment with Rain's Fool when he talks about his son for the only time, Tilly and Mary Beth kind of had that similar role where you could sit down and talk to them. There was also that nice moment when I was talking about what happened with her and Miss Grimshaw, with the guy who tried to kidnap her because she did something. So I think she's a good character. I don't know if she's definitely, I think, B at least. You could argue A. And obviously this also comes from my experience with the characters as well, right? Like, there might be great other moments with other characters like that I didn't see, so she fits good there. Maybe I'll move, I don't know if I should move, let's leave her there. Actually, for now we'll decide if we move anyone based on later stuff. Now Bill, Now, I really didn't know what to feel about Bill. I mean, he left kind of that bad first impression, and it felt like that moment where he messes up in the train never really, he never really got away from that. For me at least, I think, and even if it wasn't his fault, from then onwards, he just kind of stuck in my head as like a stupid kind of character. But in terms of like how I felt about him, there was a few moments that you can kind of see like that him and Arthur don't really like each other to begin with. That kind of like awkward moment that he's there, you have to work with him. I'm thinking B or C. Okay, put Bill there. Now Lenny and put Lenny there. Definitely one of my favorite side characters. After Sean died, Lenny was then my favorite character. I think I said this before, but I always kind of like that kind of uncle nephew kind of thing they had with Arthur and Lenny, where like I like that moment where Lenny's feeling like he doesn't belong and Arthur kind of comforts him. He was a naive character, I think. Yeah, that was his kind of fault. It was and you could kind of see that. His death was also really good. I think his death was probably one of the most powerful in terms of the way they incorporated gameplay into it, but we'll talk about that later, of course, in the next section. Definitely one of my favorite characters. Now, Uncle, he goes, if the epilogue didn't exist, he would literally be F, right? Because he didn't do anything. There wasn't really anything he really did in the main game, I think, apart from maybe just showing up a few times, maybe a few camp conversations. Really, like I'm just here, like, what's this guy done the whole game? Why is he in the gang? Some useless guy. But then he comes along in the epilogue, and I think, I'm gonna have to make a whole new tier.
Old times. It's good to have the old gang back together again.
Let's just hope things don't turn out like last time.
There he goes. What'd I tell you, Charles? Boy is as sour as weak old milk. No wonder she didn't stay with you. Not even a retired $2 whore would stay with you. That's the goddamn truth. Now, you used to be decent company, but now you're worse than a snake with a toothache. All he does is whine.
Excuse me?
Oh, don't get all angry. It ain't gonna change nothing. You're hopeless. And I mean that literally. You got no hope. I mean, look at you. Look at this place. Your dream home. I've had better nightmares than this dream. Oh, darling Abigail, I've changed. Come live with me in an outhouse I wouldn't ask my worst enemy to take a shit in.
What are you trying to say?
It's awful. It's a dump. The house has gotta go. Get some self-respect, you miserable sack of shit. Build a house a lady'd set foot in.
The place just needs a woman's touch.
It needs leveling. No woman would touch this place. Now, I reckon these horses can have it down in a minute. Here, come on. Tie that end around the horses. You loop that end around there. Horses will pull it clean down.
He is the best character in the game. 10 out of 10. Him and John, like the interactions, bro. Amazing character. Nothing more needs to be said. That's the way it's going to be. Now, Micah. Oh, this is going to be difficult. Every Micah mission is amazing. I kind of figured out something was off about Micah, like at chapter 6, I think. There was literally a moment where I was just sitting there. I was like, wait, so Micah's been in every shootout where we've been kicked out of a town or whatever. He's been there. A lot of the choices, like the whole thing with the Braithwaites and the Greys, the moving from Horseshoe Overlook to Clements Point, which the Pinkertons found. A lot of his decisions that he told to Dutch and Dutch did were the exact wrong things for Dutch to do. So at that point, I was like, what is he really about? Does he have like a deeper ulterior motive? Because I always thought, like from the very beginning, I thought he was kind of like this force of nature type of character. Like he's just bad. Some people, they need some villain that, are morally grey, or his family died or whatever. He went mad. Sometimes it's just good to have a villain who's just bad for the sake of it. Like he's bad. He knows he's bad. He likes that he's bad. Brings chaos. That type of villain is very good a lot of the times. And I think that kind of pure chaos villain, I think is a very, very powerful thing to have nowadays, since I think people are just trying to focus on making like these morally grey, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having like a morally grey, deep kind of character that, he's got motives and all this kind of stuff. I just think that people try too hard nowadays. Anyway, I'll move on. But then to find out that he was working with the Pinkertons, it kind of diminished him in my mind a bit. I don't know why, but like at the time I was like, it kind of made it less interesting. Where does he go on the list is important. Great villain. Actually, I wouldn't. That's a good question, actually. I think probably someone's made like a 3-hour video on that. Who's the villain of Red Dead Redemption 2? Because, you could say, some people could say, it's Micah, but I think personally, he's the endpoint that kind of causes stuff to happen at some points, but he's not the cause of it. But anyway, where does Micah go? Thinking, because he has a lot of good moments, some crazy moments. I think he has to go top of A. He could be an S, but in the end, I think there's some stuff from, like, I would have liked to see more from him. Or some people would like to see less of him, but I think there's certain aspects of him I wish were tweaked. But I really like the way that he went out, though, in terms of, we'll get into that. But this is the way, like, he's not even really salty or whatever. He's just like, oh, you got me. Just falls down, dies. Okay, Mary Beth. Mary Beth, I think, is, as I said, like, her and Tilly basically have that kind of same role where you can go back and, like, talk to them. But the issue is that Tilly does have a few extra things I don't really remember, apart from the part in the epilogue where Mary Beth says she's like a writer or whatever. I don't remember her being in any other part of any like, important mission. She might have to go in C, because I think Tilly does a better job in terms of, or she might C or B. Okay, she was interesting at certain points, I think, with the conversations, but I don't really remember too much of like any main thing that she did. Charles, I think Charles is okay. I liked how he was kind of like that honorable character in the gang. Like, obviously you could argue that some of the characters were honorable, like you could say at certain points Hosea obviously and Javier, they kind of had a bit of a not high honor, but like, or Lenny, they kind of had some sort of honor to them, you could argue at certain points. I really liked how he was kind of like that honorable kind of character that was in the gang. He also was very involved in that chapter 6, the Native American storyline, that really interested me at certain points. And like how he, obviously in the last section I talked about that the conversation between him and Arthur, that was really interesting. There's obviously that mission where you can kind of see like the angry side of him, where he kills those poachers who were killing those, I forgot what they were. I thought it was interesting how he was used in the epilogue as well with Sadie. I think I'm just struggling to decide if I like him more or less. I think I like him. He scrapes out a bit ahead of both. I think he's there. Pearson. Pearson's an interesting character because apparently there's a lot with him, but I missed it. So parts that he certainly was there were pretty good, but obviously there's that classic credit scene where he's in the shop and that kind of brings him up a lot. He's married, he's in Rhodes, and he looks at the picture of the gang. But apparently there's a lot with him that I missed, like in terms of going back to it doesn't feel fair for me, I think, to put him in like D. I don't put him in D. I think he probably is with Miss Grimshaw, I think. There, B. Now, Molly I kind of feel bad for, because she was like you could tell nobody liked her in the gang, if you know what I mean. She was just not a very liked or cherished member of the gang, really. Initially, right, she'd probably go in F, because the whole thing, she says she betrayed Dutch, or she like caused the Saint-Denis heist to go wrong. It's revealed later with Agent Milton that she didn't tell the Pinkertons anything, so then it's kind of like a sad attempt to get Dutch's attention, and obviously I'll talk about that later, but otherwise I think that she wasn't really liked at all by the gang, which is a good contrast with Mary Linton, but she's not. I don't really think she was too good of a character in general, so I might have to put her in F regardless. Yeah, she might have to go in F or D, just to have someone in F. Not really sorry, she goes there. Last but not least, Trelawney. I think he's a great character. Like, he was only in the story for a little bit, I think, in comparison to kind of like the characters who were around the whole time. Like he's in and out of the story a lot, so, and he leaves the gang and he goes back to England or wherever. I can't remember where he goes, but I think he was a good character. The moments he's kind of like that charming, kind of like deceiving, like salesman guy. I think he kind of is above, like usually he'd probably be around Strauss, but there's a whole boat mission that I like. He kind of in Saint-Denis in chapter 4, I really like that. It kind of elevates him to, I'd say, bottom of A. Actually, maybe there's a few missions that he does that are really good. I think he might go top of B, bottom of A. Just to be fair, I'll just put him top of B from bottom of A. Okay, so I'm not going to rank the rest of these characters because I don't know, obviously Milton or the other characters are here, but I'm not going to rank the rest of them, so that's it. All these characters in general are great. I don't think any of them are, when I mean F tier, that's obviously F being relative to other characters. Like, you can't compare Molly to Dutch or Molly to Sean. This is obviously based on what I played as well, so I didn't fully beat everything in terms of, in one playthrough. I didn't see every interaction, every conversation. There might be certain conversations or certain interactions that push certain characters up. See you back in the past. In this section, I did want to kind of talk about each of the characters' deaths and in general collapse of the gang, what or who led to it in my opinion, and of course everyone's favourite Tahitian mango farmer. The first character who dies that we see on screen is Davy Kylander, I think I'm saying that right, in chapter 1. Now this death to many won't hold much weight. I think it's important to mention because it's one of those things that makes us feel we're just dropped into the world. The story isn't catered around us. Explaining all of the characters before we get into the game, it's a very critical situation motivation, and they show this via a seemingly important character to the gang dying basically at the beginning. This also acts as a catalyst for other important character introspections and moments that add to the immersion. It's not the most impactful death to the player, but it's still to the gang to make it feel real. Mac, his brother, is also a character who dies this time off screen. He's tortured by the Pinkertons. This is something also that wouldn't make the player particularly feel anything because they don't have a connection with him, but we've never met Mac. He got captured in Blackwater, if I'm not mistaken, but it's still enough to piss Arthur off when Agent Milton tries to taunt him about it at the lake. Again, it's a not so impactful death to the player, but it's impactful for the characters. First death I think the players will really remember and point to as being a turning point and a shit got real moment is of course Sean's death. Sean was my favourite side character up until this point. So the manner in which they killed him to me was masterful. It has the effect of really putting you on edge. Many people may not exactly like or resonate with Sean, but he felt to me as like kind of the cool cousin sometimes you visit and chill with, who's basically like a brother to you, if that makes sense. So the abrupt, just instant death that he faced mid-talking, from him talking to having a hole in his skull flopping onto the ground, just instantly puts into perspective that the world is not messing around. You cannot mess around. Do not try and deceive these people and think you're going to get away unscathed. We hadn't really had an impactful death for us, the player, for the whole game, and of course depending on what companion missions you did, you might not care exactly about Sean or you might care less, but it's still an exceptionally grim reminder that your actions have consequences in this world. People don't like to be fucked with. The death you dispense onto others can and will be dispensed onto you. The death after this being Kieran's was another reminder, but I think this one's much more darker. Kieran for a while does go missing and I found this strange and I took note of this, but I didn't exactly expect what happened to him to be the outcome. He's killed off screen, but we see his corpse on his horse holding his severed head with his eyes gouged out as revenge for him essentially betraying the O'Driscolls. You can kind of assume that they got to him and did all kinds of stuff to him before ultimately riding him back to the camp for all to see in such a gruesome fashion. Kieran was a really good character and it would have been cool to maybe see him in chapter 6, maybe like what would he have done or helped, etc. And it did kind of suck to see him have such an ending. But similarly to Sean, this is the point I feel like they were trying to get home. Not everyone gets to develop and blossom. In life, people with potential get snuffed out all the time. What they could have done, who they were, what they wanted to become, all in that moment does not matter anymore. The next two character deaths happened in the same mission, and I think this was a really good idea because these kind of deaths contrast each other really well. Hosea and Lenny, one very senior member of the gang and one being the youngest member of the gang who participates in the activities. Obviously Jack is the youngest, but Lenny is the youngest person who actively does stuff. But Hosea's death felt really wrong. It's probably the worst way for a character like that to go out. Not as bad as in Rockstar did a bad job, but tragic. It's a slow, drawn out death in a cutscene. He's captured by the Pinkertons, used as a hostage, and basically put down like a dog, if I'm going to be honest, and it was really hard to watch. You can kind of see him as this wise uncle-like figure to Arthur in a way. The only one who can really reason to Dutch not to do something stupid, and it's really sad what happens in that situation. To contrast this, we have Lenny, who, by the way, was my favourite side character after Sean. He acts as that nephew, or even some could say son, type character to Arthur. He's naive, he has some backstory, and he even has some kind of doubt about himself, or if he really belongs. And it was really nice to see him and Arthur's interactions. Lenny gets killed off in gameplay, which was way worse as the player, because even though you know it's scripted, the abrupt nature of Lenny being right in front of you, you can move, and watching him die in your arms in gameplay and not have it be a cutscene added a lot of weight, for me at least, in the scene, and made it feel like that you failed him. You can argue that Hosea was just kind of a bad situation, but to you, in theory, in the story, it could have saved Lenny. When it comes to the next death, which is Molly, I personally didn't care too much about her in the first place, but there are some interesting comparisons here to be made, particularly between her and Mary Linton, as we talked about earlier. Mary is the one who left and realized Arthur would just never change. Molly thought she could change Dutch. She didn't realize he didn't feel any type of way near to that towards her. She ultimately tries to get his attention in a way that she really ultimately doomed herself, because what she said she did by being the rat to the Pinkertons puts her in a bad situation with everybody in the camp, and I got the feeling she wasn't exactly viewed that highly before that either. So it was either going to be Dutch killing a member of the gang, which could have made him worse in chapter 6, or someone else, who was Miss Grimshaw, who came in and shot her. We found out later, of course, she didn't tell the Pinkertons anything or hardly anything. I kind of feel bad for her because I think she thought that she was more liked or valued than she was in the gang. Now, Miss Grimshaw Grimshaw is the last death we'll talk about here because at this point in the story, really the gang doesn't exist anymore. The most tertiary or non-fighting members have left, and it's really split between those who are with Dutch and Micah or those who are with Arthur and John. I think this death is really telling about the state of the characters in the story. Arthur is locked in on taking down Micah, so he can't do anything as Micah shoots Miss Grimshaw because she hesitates, and in the whole scene you can hear her screaming while Dutch at this point has beyond lost it. It's really sad too because in a way Miss Grimshaw was kind of that protective mother-like figure to others in the gang, so for her to be taken out in that kind of way kind of shows the depths of how the characters are thinking, to not have any comfort or type of retaliation because of it. It's a very impactful and sad death because she was a character you could feel, and at least in my opinion, was trying to keep things together and believed in both Dutch and Arthur sincerely. Onto what was ultimately the cause of the collapse of the gang. Was it Micah? Was it the Pinkertons? Was it that dying sense of the Wild West that doomed it? Or was it something else? I think the final nail was Micah being the rat, but if you pay attention, of course, you can see who's really at fault. Of course, everyone knows at the core of the issue it was Dutch. I'm sure we can blame other aspects like Micah in the end, but ultimately Milton tells us that Micah was only a rat from chapter 5 onwards, which I found strange. He has us in a position where he doesn't need to lie when he tells us this, so there's no real reason to not believe him in my opinion. So I think the idea behind a second rat is interesting, but ultimately that doesn't encompass the problem either. Who was the one who wanted to leave it all behind, to get a large amount of noise and then slip away, but failing each time to the point where characters die? And by the way, I hoped people picked up on this at each character's death I mentioned earlier. Each character's death is something that has reverberations throughout the gang. Each one holds weight thematically, of course, regardless if they're explicitly mentioned earlier. So for example, Sean was a cold reminder that your actions do have consequences. We're in a very bad situation still. Kieran was that kind of catalyst for paranoia, I feel. Remember, Kieran just disappeared one day and then reappeared as he did, adding a lot of mystery and doubt throughout the gang, particularly Dutch, I feel. How long have the O'Driscolls known about Shady Belle? How did they get Kieran like they did? What did he tell them, if anything? All of this also while serving as that gruesome reminder. The death of Hosea, of course, I think it's arguable, but I think the death of Hosea definitely had that larger impact than the death of Lenny, sorry to say, as it was basically that forceful removal of the angel on Dutch's shoulder. There is no one really to stop Micah from filling Dutch's head with conspiracy, doubt, and bad plans, along with Dutch's already bad plan. Molly's death is a death that people might not have really picked up on. It really was that beginning to the erosion of trust throughout the gang. After this point, we see lines being drawn, more confrontational dialogue, and of course, what happens in the end with the complete split and collapse of the gang, as I said, with Miss Grimshaw's death. It was ultimately Dutch's plan that caused all of this. So you could kind of say that the Blackwater massacre was the beginning of the end in a way, as he is dead set on leaving the dying American frontier. But of course, we actually need to discuss Dutch, our favorite mango farmer, as a character in his entirety and in more detail to talk about how it's really his fault. So a good way to start this off would basically be to go through how I viewed Dutch as a character throughout the game. I initially, as I said, kind of viewed him as that good leader, trying to do his best to keep everything from falling apart, and as honorable as an outlaw could be to the members of his family, of course. His enemies from the beginning knew no mercy. He was kind of that father figure for a lot of people in the gang. However, around chapter 3's end, I kind of got a bit shaky about how I thought of him. I started to see some interesting signs that he's not who I originally thought he was. I started to get the idea in my head. Perhaps he doesn't actually view the gang in the same way as they viewed him early on. It was really Bronte's speech or description of Dutch that really opened my eyes to a few things.
We are simple country folk. All we have is each other. And you have gone and you have took his son over some dispute with some inbred ex-slavers. It ain't got nothing to do with any one of us.
You had nothing to do with destroying the liquor business!
We was innocent bystanders. And that which we weren't innocent of, well, we most surely were ignorant of.
You twist words, you lie shamelessly, you think you are better than everyone else. Ti adoro. Date da bere sti uomini. Angelo Bronte.
Dutch Vanderland. Arthur Morgan.
The pleasure is mine.
John Marston.
he's a manipulator, he's a liar, and I thought at this point he views the gang as an extension of himself in a way, of his power and influence, and the eventual degradation of the gang would kind of coincide with his mental degradation. While that could be an interpretation of what happened, I would say that's not the full story. I would say yes, Dutch loses it throughout the whole course of the game, as even Arthur theorizes and points out. He's probably always been like this. He's just always had this mask, or he's just been good at hiding the way he feels towards the rest of the gang. Perhaps there is some greater meaning in this, but I found it interesting how Dutch, who is the one who took out all the heads or leaders of the other groups or factions in the game, we see this with Leviticus Cornwall, of course directly, with Angelo Bronte as well, Catherine Braithwaite, who was basically pushed to her death, not directly killing her, but definitely something he was responsible for, and of course also Colm O'Driscoll. I think this could have a lot of different deeper meanings. Does he always do it because he sees it as some sort of way to exert his control and dominance? Because a lot of the time he's killing these leaders, it really isn't anything more than an ego play for Dutch. It could be argued he's a hypocrite as well. While Dutch throughout the game mulls the death of an era, the Wild West, the consolidation of power to arms of the government and other forms of sanctioned violence, he himself throughout the game kind of mirrors these structures and replaces that facade of family. There was a really intriguing ride with Dutch where he kind of shows his level of hypocrisy when it comes to this, using the idea of the gang being a family and then kind of circumventing this idea later. Take a listen.
Thank you. For what?
For taking my side back there.
It ain't about sides.
Feels like Hosea's lost his spine.
This move on Bronte, is it for the bank job or revenge for what happened at the trolley station?
Both. Neither. What does it matter? We need to hit that bank, and Bronte has the police and just about everything else in Saint Denis in his back pocket. He also set us up, and lest we forget, took young Jack.
I understand. We just got a lot of pots on the boil, given all the folks who's out gunning for us.
You all seem to have forgotten how money is made and what it takes to support 20 people, let alone what it takes to give 20 people a new life overseas.
With all due respect, Dutch, is this Tahiti plan really gonna work out?
You tell me, Arthur. Is it? Have some goddamn faith! I am bending over backwards to make a future for us!
I know, but...
When did you become so small-minded? If you'd rather we break up the family, go our separate ways, just tell me.
Of course not.
This isn't a prison camp. I am not forcing anybody to stay. So either we're in this together, working together to get out together, or we're not. There simply isn't a reality in which we do nothing and get everything.
I know. You're right. Just feels like we're on borrowed time again. I mean, the O'Driscolls found us.
Yeah, we need to move, and soon. Haven't I made that clear? I feel like I'm going in circles with all of you. Micah is the only one left with any loyalty.
Now, that ain't fair.
You are talking like John. I swear that woman is poisoning him against me. I've seen it before. What's the problem here?
There ain't a problem.
You think Micah would question going after Bronte? No! He'd say, let's go!
I'm here, ain't I? I've been at your side for 20 years.
I know. I'm sorry, son. It's just the endless debate about everything is wearing me down. The others, I can take. But when you're not behind me, it hurts.
I'm behind.
Blackwater, Valentine, Rhodes, Sean, Kieran. I promise. None of it will be in vain. We are going to make it.
I know we will.
Then later throughout the game as well, we see the dominoes kind of fall in an interesting way, particularly in chapter 4 and 5, and of course 6. The way I would put it is his moral degradation, maybe mask slipping, but I do think there's definitely an element of delving into insanity and delusion that took place here with Dutch that he didn't have beforehand. We go from him killing Angelo Bronte in the manner which he did, could have been out of character to some people. Then he goes on and in chapter 5 kills the old lady in Guarma, which she might have been a threat in terms of her telling the authorities on the island, and she did try to scam Dutch and Arthur if I remember correctly. Him killing her even is a huge shock to Arthur, and Arthur has known Dutch for 15 years, so this makes it more impactful. And the Dutch's bullshit isn't getting past Arthur this time. And it's also interesting in the same time frame, just moments before, we kind of see Dutch try to rationalize in his head leaving behind John to hang, trying to make up some excuses that maybe John betrayed the gang, maybe he's the rat, etc. So even at this point in the story, we kind of see him show his disregard for those in the gang following him. In chapter 6 beginning with Molly, he definitely would have killed her in my eyes if Miss Grimshaw didn't, I feel. At this point, I would like to point out the idle dialogue that Dutch starts before the mission, It's Murphy Country. Take a listen.
White to D4. Black to F5. White to G3. Knight to F6. Bishop to G2. Black to G6. Knight to F3. White to D4. Black to F.
That is a move in chess called the Dutch's Defense, from my understanding, as someone who doesn't know really anything about chess at all. But from what I've gathered from people in the chat and then later on looking around for purposes of this review, is that this is a very aggressive move that you essentially sacrifice your own pawns to get an early dominant position. The fact that he just sits there repeating it over and over, one, shows his refusal to change his behavior and tactics, which we all know what the definition of true insanity is doing something over and over and expecting a different result. At this point, I got the idea in my head that Dutch doesn't care. He's willing to just throw and sacrifice anyone in the name of solving his problems regardless of who they are. And he does kind of do that. On a side point, we talked a bit about eagle flies and how quickly Dutch kind of egged him on to basically get what Dutch wanted in the end, regardless of the consequences for his people. I think this is especially impactful because we get to see Dutch's manipulation from the outside looking in this time. Sure, Eagle Flies has this kind of vengeful spirit to him, but you cannot deny that the validation and the confirmation that Dutch gives him very quickly to manipulate him is very telling about Dutch's character. Then there's the mission that I feel kind of confirmed my theory, when Dutch leaves Arthur to die, which then causes Eagle Flies to die. Interestingly enough, the mission that this takes place in is called My Last Son. Now, this could be, of course, referencing Eagle Flies being Rainsfall's last son, but I've always had this idea that it kind of maybe represents Dutch as well. Dutch and Arthur, or maybe Dutch and Eagle Flies, as that kind of that double meaning behind it. I think it could be Eagle Flies because he's really the last character that Dutch newly kind of manipulates and acts a bad influence to Eagle Flies, that Eagle Flies is only able to do what he does recklessly as he does it via Dutch's exploitation. When it comes to what happens ultimately with both John and Arthur, with Dutch basically leaving them both for dead, it could symbolize what I was talking about before, but it also could kind of show another aspect we haven't really talked about. Micah's influence on Dutch grows increasingly throughout the game. Perhaps contrary to what I might have said earlier, perhaps initially I don't think Dutch from the beginning is a pure evil character. He's a much more nuanced and complex character that people could make whole 2-hour analysis about him and everything he does, how it's impactful. What I mean to say is that I thought he always had this very manipulative, hypocritical, power-hungry side to him, but it definitely isn't the case that he was, just bad from the start. I think at some point he did have those traits of being a protective leader, caring about other members of the gang, and I think this is lost in his descent into insanity, which is guided by a little rat, Micah Bell, who I personally always thought was a chaotic, pure evil type of character from the beginning, kind of like a force of nature, but regardless, throughout chapter 6, so without the check, which is Hosea, the devil on Dutch's shoulder is always there whispering to him, doing a very similar manipulation to Dutch as he once did to others, and Dutch falls for it again and again. There's several moments in the game where you step into a room or a place where both Micah and Dutch were just talking and they both just stop. It's hard to describe, but it's kind of like that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking because they were just all talking about you, and it's really awkward. You can kind of see Dutch maybe go from just trying to rationalize to actually believing his own ramblings and conspiracies against his family. Like how he gets angry at Arthur from helping out at Wapiti, kind of sees it as, if Arthur's been keeping this from me, what else has he been doing situation. And Micah's also positioning himself in the Dutch's head for him not to be the rat, when it's Micah who's the one who thinks that there's a rat in the gang. There's also Arthur going to save John from Siska, which really makes Dutch angry and perhaps more resentful too. Arthur directly is going against what he ordered. At this point, as we said, Dutch really doesn't have this outlaw, free, go make money type of mentality. Would be more encompassing of the Wild West. As even Uncle points out in some hidden dialogue, he wants to be an American king with his knights, and at that point it does kind of come out of nowhere because he says this in chapter 2 and you can kind of disregard it, but it does really reflect on how Dutch is later on in the game. I do want to kind of end this part with asking you guys what your interpretation is. I really like how open-ended he is with how deep you can get with your interpretations of him as a character. Was he always pure evil? Was he, maybe he's a tragic villain on a path down onto insanity? Now, of course, as we finish up this incredibly long 2-part review of Red Dead Redemption 2, I of course want to talk about the ending of both chapter 6 itself in the mission Red Dead Redemption and the epilogue, which is American Venom, as I feel like they're both as important as each other to mention. You can't really talk about American Venom without talking about Red Dead Redemption first. So I thought the ending which I got, which was the high honor, go back for John ending, was the perfect ending, just by the nature of how everything played out, from Dutch's realization to Micah living to Arthur ultimately dying in the way he did. It really was something that I just can't describe how it made me feel. Even got, a few tears out of me just because of the connection that you feel with these characters after hundreds of hours of played as Arthur. Of course, you can't mention this ending without mentioning the "You're my brother, I know" scene. The layers of symbolism and build up to this moment, as I said, from watching Arthur and John go from not really liking each other at all, being skeptical throughout the story, then Arthur's new perspective leading him down to doing this final act, this time a good deed, a loving act he will never be lauded for. From his knowledge, he may never be celebrated or acknowledged for his sacrifice, apart from John knowing himself. Even that could just fail or end up not working. He's doing it out of his heart. Also, just the theme of family and how ties in so well here, with the collapse of the gang which just happened moments before. This is what real brotherhood is. This is what family is, and the way Rockstar were able to make all of it not feel in a kind of goofy way, it really was emotional. And the way this then basically culminates in the final stand for Arthur: your horse dead, your tuberculosis is really close to killing you, Pinkertons encroaching, Dutch and Micah, Bill and Javier could be anywhere, but at least you got John to safety. That's all that really matters to Arthur in the moment. He knows that this is his last shootout, so with revolver in hand he goes to confront death. And then of course the very tense fist fight with Micah. You can feel the tension here. You so desperately want to take out this traitor, this rat, if you have the chance. But in the end, Dutch helps Micah, stopping you from grabbing your revolver. But the weight of Arthur's speech to Dutch, "I gave you all I had," this is very much a contrast to the interaction with John moments ago. Dutch could very well be described as a father figure to Arthur. The desperation and acceptance that Arthur displays here is unfounded. What I mean is, he still cares about Dutch here. He tells him Micah is a rat, and he says it with all his heart, and is trying to help Dutch here. If he didn't care, he would just spout some nonsense at him, and not even still trying to convince him. And what happens next really confuses me about Dutch, because this is what really leaves the door open to interpretation. Arthur does kind of get through to him in some way. It bothers Dutch on a really deep level that we see later on in the epilogue what the after effect is. Micah ultimately leaves and scurries away like the rat he is, still trying to go straight for the money, but Dutch doesn't go with him. Micah's survival is crucial for this part of the ending. It cements it as a tragedy. Even with all our heart, we still couldn't stop him for now. This isn't some fairy tale ending where Dutch suddenly goes with Arthur, helps kill Micah. He just wanders off without him. It's a strong enough rejection of Micah, or more reaction to Arthur's speech to show that what Arthur said kind of got through to him. Of course, there's that final shot of Arthur, him facing the setting sun one last time. What a powerful, beautiful, and perfect ending to one of the best stories in gaming. That would be, unless we still had to talk about the final ending of the game in the epilogue, American Venom. And this is what kind of cements it from being a masterpiece to being something beyond that. The revenge for Arthur, the hunting down of Micah, how the story goes full circles in many ways. While chapter 6 is perfect, it cannot be as thoroughly enjoyed without American Venom as the final jewel in the crown. The whole run up with Sadie and Charles to the top of Mount Hagen while taking out Micah's new gang felt really powerful as it's one last charge, one last standoff, one last loose end, one last social call, one could say. The reason why I say that it goes full circle here is because of the standoff with Micah. He seems really strong. He's taken Sadie hostage as well, and then the third combatant enters the fray, Dutch, and I really found his new appearance and kind of demeanor, style to really reflect on what he's become. He's a mess in comparison to what we see in the base chapters. He's fully grown his beard. He speaks in a very concise but cryptic way. You can't really tell what he's thinking. He's even more dangerous now, in my opinion. I found when John asked him what he's doing here, his response, same as you, I suppose. This I feel is a very good indicator of Dutch's mindset now. He speaks in this very monotone, nonchalant way. Micah doesn't even pick up on it. I think maybe Micah thought or assumed he's meant the Blackwater money. Either that way he didn't pick up on what Dutch just said, because we all know why John is here. It's to kill Micah. I thought the way Dutch went ahead and was the one to shoot Micah, which ultimately leads to Micah's death, and the way he just leaves was powerful too. He still in some aspects here is the same and hasn't changed. He will never admit that he was the one who was wrong. He will always meander and push accountability to the side. The best we can get was him shooting Micah, and that's really up for interpretation as well to why he did it. Was it because of Arthur? Was it because of John? Was it ultimately because he didn't like Micah or didn't have some use for him? I also want to point out, of course, here talking about full circle, the location of the standoff, Mount Hagen, Amberino, where our story started, as it started with us finding Micah in the snow, and it ends with us finding Micah in the snow in a very cyclical, nice way, which you could probably derive some meaning or complexity from. Now, to finally conclude this huge review, sorry this took a while to do, but I feel like it was really worth me doing it in this manner. Before I get to the final score, I do want to say a few more things. Of course, we didn't talk about everything in this review. It would have been impossible for me to do so with how long it is already. I really want your guys' feedback on what I could do better, what I could have talked about, on what you guys have a different interpretation of, because as an outsider, I don't exactly what's been kind of the agreed upon interpretations or law implications that may already exist. I was just going from the basics, what my chat told me, my own thoughts, opinions, and observations. So I'd really like to hear what you guys felt throughout the game, and what did it do for you. Did certain parts hit for you the same way? Did you maybe see certain parts differently than I did? Please leave your comments, and I thank you for getting this far in the video. You don't know how much it helps me. You don't know how much it helps if you just like and subscribe, share it out. If you help me be able to make these videos just by being around. I have a Patreon link in the description, but don't feel some sort of obligation to do anything. Your support watching the video and time is enough. Now, for those of you who have watched part 1, you'll know I gave Red Dead Redemption 2's gameplay and experience a 10 out of 10. A very, very, very rare rating. Can only be given to a very select few games. Now, does the main story elements back it up in the same kind of way? I would have to say up until chapter 5, yes, it would be a perfect 10, but I can't call this game a perfect game or a perfect 10 with chapter 5 being the way it is. A perfect 10 for me is a game that meets its full potential. To kind of describe it, if Rockstar had all the time in the world to make the game at the time of it, all the money, could they have done better? Gameplay wise, I thought it was perfect, but Guarma as a section does let the story down to a 9.9 out of 10. So ultimately, even though it might be comical, I have to give Red Dead Redemption 2 a score of 9.95 out of 10, because even beyond even consideration of being a masterpiece, but it's not completely perfect in all its aspects, because things like time and I would say resources, as I believe they knew Guarma wasn't the best that they could have done for that section. If it was just a mission that was meh, I could have left it at 10, but Guarma is literally the basis for a chapter and had so much potential that ultimately lets it down, but in all other aspects of the story, there was peak writing, peak symbolism, thematically, character-wise. I couldn't give you a game better in all of its full aspects. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. As I said before, if you like this review, the Red Dead Redemption 2 review, part 2, I don't know if I'm going to combine these two together, if you guys want me to do that, to like make it more like of a package, right? If you want me to like make it more of like a package thing, I could. See you guys next time. Bye.